So we should be live at the first Media Lab exchange, probably of a series of Media Lab exchanges, considering the importance of the European Media Freedom Act and the numerous discussions that it will trigger. I'm Caroline de Kock, and I will have the pleasure of moderating this exchange. And we will be looking at the reactions of key stakeholders and policymakers to the European Media Freedom Act, which was published in September. Our panelists today are MEP Strugariu from the Renew Group in the European Parliament, Renate Schröder, Director of the European Federation of Journalists, Eva Shimon, Senior Advocacy Officer at Liberties, Audrey Perkauskas, Deputy Head of Unit at the European Commission, and Dr. Joan Barata, Fellow at the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. I should add that Dr. Barata is joining us from Kampala, where he's doing very important fundamental rights work, and so his connection might be patchy at times. The bios of our panelists are on our website, and you can post questions in the YouTube chat of this live stream. So, in order to create an interactive format between the various panelists, the event will be split in 2 rounds of intervention, with speakers expected in each round to intervene for a maximum of 3 minutes. Round 1 is the Breathe In round, where our panelists are asked to highlight which Media Freedom Act elements made them sigh with relief. Round 2 is the Breathe Out round, where the focus is on the Media Freedom Act elements that made them sigh with disappointment. I should add, those can be elements that are in it or elements that you did not find in it. And if there's time left at the end, we will do a Q&A, although I should add that MEP Strugariu, due to other commitments, will have to leave the live stream early. So let me start with round 1. And I will give the floor to Renate Schröder.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm very happy to do some yoga, breathe in and breathe out. I think we all need it these days. Well, just in short, I do want to stress that it is extremely important to have a draft proposal from the European Commission on the Media Freedom Act, on issues like editorial independence, protection of sources, concentration of media ownership, all that up to now had been said, this is none of our business. The Commission cannot deal with media. We do not have a legal framework for that. Now this is possible, and this, I think, is a political novum, and as such extremely important to see that we have the internal market legal basis there connected with fundamental rights and the recognition that journalism is a public good. That by itself is worth fighting for. Just a few points, and I'm sure there will be more on the brief outside, but I think it's important to say, yes, we welcome there is something on editorial independence from member states, from the political side, but also internal editorial independence. It is important that we have guarantees on safeguards against spywares and protection of sources. It is, of course, very important that there are safeguards for the independence of public service media, including the financial sustainability of public service media. We do need a strong European board, a sort of new ERGA dealing with all this, having the competences to also deal with the online world. And it is mentioned, fortunately, that concentration of ownership is recognized as a danger to media pluralism. There are many howevers, but I'll get to that, to the other point, and I'm sure the other speakers have more to add, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Renate. I think that's why we wanted to start with the breathe in sigh of relief. I think it's good to start with stating the fact that everyone, I think, welcomes the fact that there is an act. And then afterwards, obviously, there are discussions about what should be in it. Let me switch now to Eva Shimon from Liberties. Let me put you full screen.
So thank you so much for organizing this event, and I think I fully agree with what Renata has just said about the importance of the Media Freedom Act, that there is a proposal, and this is a very important step forward to ensure and sustain and safeguard media freedom and pluralism across Europe. This is very important because media have traditionally been the competence of member states. However, the threats posed to media freedom became so evident that I think this was very timely to have at least a proposal for a strong European Media Freedom Act. Just to give you an example, so the war in Ukraine clearly shows how state-controlled media is used as a weapon to spread disinformation, or also to manipulate citizens to keep autocratic regime in power. And we need safeguards against these. What I think it's very important, the form of the act. So because this is a regulation, it's a bold step, and it means that the Media Freedom Act is going to be a binding legislative act. So comparing to the previous Audiovisual Media Services Directive, or previously the Television Without Border Directive, those only set out goals, and it was up to the individual member states to devise their own laws how to reach these goals. However, a strong Media Freedom Act as a regulation could have a significant impact on national member states. So I think this is a very good starting point, and the picture that is drawn by the Commission and the problems that are tackled are the significant ones. The political pressure, media concentration, non-independent media authorities, improper allocation of state funding and state advertisement, the lack of protection of journalists and their sources. These are very important. And yes, we think that this is a very challenging exercise because there are 27 EU member states with 27 different media markets and different media consumption behavior. But having the perspective of the EU single market, it is very important to have an enforceable, strong Media Freedom Act. And as I've already said, this is a very important first step towards that.
Thank you, Eva. So we're glad the act is there. And we're glad the act is a regulation because it will hence apply to member states without having to wait for their own implementation to take place. I'm interested now to see what the view of Dr. Baratta is from a fundamental rights and cyber perspective.
Thank you very much. I think that the most important or the first positive thing about the Media Freedom Act is the fact that it is a Media Freedom Act and nothing else. And I'm saying this because before the text was released, there were many rumors saying that this act would perhaps be used as an opportunity to reintroduce debates or amendments that had been already raised during the debates around the DSA, for example, but they didn't make it through. So that was some sort of an opportunity to make some sort of a patchwork norm that would reintroduce certain things that were missing for some. So in this sense, I think that it was a relief to see that it was an actual Media Freedom Act that has its own, let's say, autonomy as a norm, doesn't contain strange interactions or overlaps with other existing EU legislation like the Digital Services Act, the Audiovisual Media Services Directive, the Regulation on Terrorist Content Online, or even the Copyright Directive. So this is also particularly good also for lawyers to have separate laws that cover separate aspects. And in this case, I think that this is also something that was missing because the other directives, regulations that existed in this field made references to the right to freedom of expression, to the right to freedom of the media, to the role of journalism, without properly defining them. So this regulation completes the whole approach to this matter. So this is something positive. The second thing is that, as it has already been said, it covers the relevant issues at the EU level, or that covers relevant matters that are now at the core of the discussions at the national level on media legislation in the EU, issues of editorial independence, protection of sources, protection of journalists, the independence of public service, so on and so forth, media concentration. This has already been said. And the last remark that I would like to make is that I believe that the Media Freedom Act will also, particularly from the point of view of human rights, create interesting synergies between what will be in this Freedom Act that is basically EU, with other existing human rights provisions and standards that also apply to EU member states, such as, say, the standards established by the Council of Europe, or even the commitments, the political commitments established by within the context of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, when it comes to media freedom. So now, I mean, the Media Freedom Act will also, let's say, be another element within the regional system for the protection of human rights in Europe. And of course, it would have also to be interpreted in light with the already existing human rights standards at the regional level, which I believe might be particularly interesting and at the same time mutually reinforcing. Thank you very much, and I hope that the connection was good. Thank you.
The connection was probably better than in Brussels on an average day. So thank you so much, Joanne, for that contribution. And I know you always look at these acts from the fact that you work across the globe. So whatever Europe does when it comes to media freedom has a role in other geographies, obviously. Let me now, we've heard civil society, we've heard academia talk about the positives in the Media Freedom Act. Let me now give the floor to MEP Strugario, who represents one of the co-legislators, and who I think has strong views about the soldiers of truth, as you call them, the journalists, and how they need to be protected.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for the excellent debate. And I'm really happy to see that we are discussing about things which are finally happening. And back to your question, EMFA itself is a huge sigh of relief, at least for those in the European Parliament who have been committed to the topic for a number of years, and we've seen how we started and where we are today. I'm really happy to say that the fact that we finally have a regulation dedicated to the topic is excellent. Now, back to more concrete proposals in the text. A huge sigh of relief is the issue of the protection of journalistic sources, obviously from Article 4. And we have seen situations where journalists were being harassed and threatened and attacked in their work. And abusedly asked to disclose their sources. I can quote a recent case in my country, Romania. A regional court instructed basically journalists to reveal their sources in an article where they literally investigated a Romanian MEP who is also a doctor, and the journalists had investigated his presence and income from a Romanian hospital, and this is basically information of public interest. Now, journalistic sources are obviously already protected by ECHR, by Article 10, but this is the first time this principle is finally clearly stated in a regulation. Then secondly, wonderful that we have a clear prohibition of spyware development in any device or machine used by media service providers, family members, employees. Article 42C has the details of that. And we are in the middle of huge spyware scandals concerning mostly journalists, activists, members of the opposition in various countries, and this has touched upon the union as well. Third point, balanced provisions of market concentration. Article 21, I will not detail further on this, but we need to assess this market concentration with transparency, in an objective manner, in a proportionate manner, non-discriminatory as well. And we need to take into account the effects of this concentration on the formation of public opinion, diversity of media players, and so on. I'm really happy to see also inclusion of safeguards for editorial independence, as well as a condition looking at the economic sustainability of an entity in the absence of the proposed concentration. And the truth is, going more deeply into the topic, that in some market concentration can work and does work because it helps small media come together, and they face costs together, and they continue to deliver information to the public independently. But in some other markets, it's a disaster. Basically, it's quite the opposite. And with this criteria, I think we can do a much better job and navigate in determining whether concentration has an impact on editorial independence or not. There's also, of course, the point of rules on financing public service media in Article 5, wonderful provisions there as well. But then if I go on like this, I will end up by mentioning the whole proposal. So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MEP Shoyal. That was a very detailed list in only a few minutes, and it certainly shows that you will not be out of a job in the next months as negotiations start. I'm very grateful to Audrius Perkauskas for having joined us, because obviously we are commenting around his baby, or at least the baby of his unit. And I think obviously you could have expected that not everyone would like everything, but I think it's good to start with the round one boost and the fact that people are grateful that the act is there and that a lot of the keywords that are in it are the ones they wanted to see. Afterwards, it's a question of filling the concept behind the keyword and the protections. Audrius, let me give you the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join this discussion, and thank you for the other participants for sharing some positive impressions of the Media Freedom Act. So for us, of course, you will not be surprised to hear that already the fact that the Media Freedom Act was proposed exactly 1 year after the President von der Leyen announced the act in her State of the Union speech. This was already for us a big achievement because those who know how the Commission functions, how the Commission is preparing initiatives. So 1 year is not an easy time frame, because you have to consult, you have to prepare an impact assessment, and then to draft the legal act itself. So let's say the past summer was pretty intense for us, and I'm proud for my team what we have achieved. Coming to substance of the act, there is another positive element I would like to highlight, because in a way we were laying foundations for the act already for quite some time. What I mean by that is that we were closely monitoring situation in European media markets and detecting issues in different member states. And sometimes, when people talk about Media Freedom Act, they say, we have issues only in certain part of Europe, we don't really need a European regulation. But this preparatory work revealed that no, in fact, issues are popping up in different parts of Europe, or at least there is a risk of problems in different parts of Europe. In other words, if a country feels safe today, it doesn't mean that the situation will be perfect eternally, and in all times. The situation actually can change very fast, because political powers, let's say, we have special affinity to media. So for example, if they dislike media, we can very fast make the life of media very hard. So this is why it's important to have common European safeguards in place. And another thing which I like about Media Freedom Act is that it has quite a comprehensive coverage. It has important provisions and safeguards for media service providers, for journalists, and it also looks into what is happening in the digital space and what are the issues, and has some targeted provisions for those matters too, like, for example, audience measurement, or how users access audiovisual media services these days. So in other words, it's a comprehensive package in an area which is marked by a strong competence of member states. So already this, in my view, is quite a big achievement. But perhaps enough to praise ourselves. So I'm curious also to listen what critical remarks the participants would have.
Thank you, Audrius, and thank you for pointing out that obviously the rules apply across the EU, and even if some member states think they're doing better, and maybe they might be right, than others, I would say then, they're fine with the rules and don't have to change anything if they're doing well. But it's still a safeguard that is reassuring, I think, to journalists and to the media sector to know that rules are in place and that they can be protected by those rules. And also that for users, that media pluralism and media freedom is protected EU-wide, regardless of the regime or of the legislative environment of a country. We're going to switch to the less happy round, the second round. And Renate, I liked your yoga analogy of mindfulness, a moment of mindfulness in Brussels. So it's round 2, the breathe out round. And there it is, looking at what, what made you sigh with disappointment, as I said, either because something was not strong enough or because something was missing. We're reversing the order of speakers slightly by giving the floor first to MEP Strugariu, as she might have to run off at some point. And if I may add, before giving you the floor, I'm pretty sure some of us that look at the Media Freedom Act as addressing both media and freedom obviously hope that we will not sigh with disappointment when it comes to the choice of committees or joint competences discussions. Let me give you the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm not sure whether I had a major, major disappointment because I was so excited with this proposal coming that I tried to look at everything quite optimistically. But nevertheless, I was a bit disappointed to see that the media ownership transparency is rather included in the recommendation and not in the regulation. And I think we have literally endless examples of how media is controlled by politicians. We have them from many places, either directly or indirectly. And people should know, they do have the right to know who is behind these media outlets in order to make informed decisions. And I'm aware that the first step is put in place by Article 6 of the draft regulation, but I would have liked to see more of Section 3 of the recommendation actually in the draft report. People really need to know to what extent the direct or beneficial owner of a media company is connected, or that company is held by a state-owned, or that is held by a state-owned company or other public bodies. And at the same time, the public should be aware, and here I would quote, basically, should know the interests of media owners in other businesses or any other interest that could influence their strategic decision-making or their editorial line. And this is a wonderful quote from the recommendation. And I'm sure that this recommendation will be taken on board by the more democratic member states, but that's not where the core problems lie. And most likely it will be ignored because it damages the interests of politicians who want to control media in less democratic states. And the same goes for the framework from editorial independence. I would have liked to see, in an ambitious attempt, more of it reflected in the text of the regulation. And as a, let's say, overarching sigh of disappointment that I have, not particularly related to EMFA, but along all of our discussions regarding media freedom and the media strength. The fact that we are still not able to do much for local media, and that they are critically underfinanced, they're severely under threat, and we should find ways to be able to support local media. And with all of the discussions that I had with this entity, they told me that basically they want those independent ones, that those who are properly doing their job, are a wonderful tool to counter fake news and disinformation. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Basically, we have to support them in doing that. And they were giving me concrete examples where they are taking the messages of the union and they're dismantling fake news deep in deep state, you know, where the problems are actually. And they're telling about how EU money is used, and that without the subvention in our agriculture, member states would not be able to, and this large agricultural and rural areas will not be able to resist, that the EU doesn't make us eat cockroaches and so on, all this huge threat of fake news that is hitting deep state mostly. And it is a pity. It is a pity because instead of trying to fight a completely uneven battle with fake news and disinformation, we should literally first and foremost support independent media in its own fight with this disinformation, and we should empower and enhance the instrument that we have at hand to counter disinformation and fake news. But overall, to conclude, we do have a wonderful starting point, and we have a very good instrument. There's room for improvement, obviously, but we're finally here after so many years. And I hope that we will be able to work very well with the members of the parliament and with the commission and also with member states. Looking forward to see their position on many of these issues because we know we've had some resistance there. But in the end, to have a clear framework for media freedom and for protecting journalists, because the reality is that a strong press is a free press, and a strong free press is the backbone, no doubt, of any democracy. Thank you so much. Apologies again that I do need to run, but we'll be happy to come back and continue to discuss on these issues with all of the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, MEP Strugario. I'm conscious of the fact that you're pressed by time, but just to summarize your point, it will be a question to do control copy and control paste of parts of the recommendation into the articles when you table amendments, and that would solve probably some of your concerns. And for the remainders, I think everyone here in the panel looks forward to working with the LIBE committee on this file. And please feel free to run off whenever you need to. Let me now give the floor to Renate Schröder, who probably agrees with some of the points made by MEP Strugario, but has maybe some other points or the same points to add, but more with a different perspective as European Federation of Journalists.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Ramona, for what you have said. Just to say at the outset, I completely agree with you on the points specifically on the lack of binding rules on media ownership transparency and binding rules on editorial independence. I think one of the main goals we have with this Media Freedom Act is to fight media capture. And media capture is not only from political, but also from economical players, all the oligarchs of this world. I think we don't have to discuss it further. So while there is, as you said yourself in Article 6, there are some needs, some obligations on media ownership, and these very few obligations are even boycotted by some of the publishers, which, to be honest, I find more than disappointing. We wonder if with such a lack of media transparency binding rules, we will in future be able to fight media capture. We will in future be able to regain trust in media, because without transparency, there is no trust. And even if we will be able to have economical, sustainable business model in journalism, because also there, besides funding for independent media, and you're completely right, we need much more than that, not only at local level, but at local level. I'm not sure if we have a future on that. So this is a big first point, and I'm sure Eva, for example, will talk more about that as well. Generally speaking, I just want to say, and I have to say, I really recognize the incredible work of the Commission that has been done, Audrius. Within a year to write such a comprehensive act has not been easy. I have talked to members of the European Commission, and I know they worked day and night on that. But having said that, the more I look into this act now, 70 pages, the more incoherent wording, imprecise wording I find, which is frustrating. I also see that in the justification and in the recitals, the Commission has been more ambitious than in some of the wording finally. So I fear there has been some pre-lobbying done already to please some stakeholders. I don't have to say the names, to please some member states. I all understand that. But we need more to protect journalists from surveillance. Here it talks about spyware, very important, but we do not only need Pegasus spyware. It's much larger than that. All the mass surveillance, all the hacking that is going on against journalists, against civil society, demands a stronger protection. Also, when it comes to protection of sources, this is weaker than what we have in terms of case law coming from the Council of Europe. It should be applicable much more in general. We also need, and I think there is a lot of discussion, there will be a lot of discussion on the European board, European media boards, the so-called ERGA Plus. While we are very much for a strong ERGA Plus, which has more competences, we are, however, concerned of its independence. We think it should be more independent from the Commission. It should have an independent secretariat. I see a lot of wording in agreement with the Commission, in agreement with the Commission. I'm not sure if they are able to do their work on their own. And the board is very important when it comes to media concentration, but also there, Ramona said, we don't have binding rules of media concentration. The Florence Center said media concentration is the main risk when it comes to market plurality. And what we have in this act so far will not be sufficient to address the amazing problem of media concentration. When it comes to allocation of state advertisement, something which is very important, we wonder why there is an exemption for local governments when it comes to below 1 million inhabitants. We know that many regions within the member states, specifically new member states, would be excluded from that. So there are many more issues we want to improve. We very much hope the European Parliament will be on our side, be it from culture, be it from civil liberties. We need to make this act much, much stronger in order to really deal with the issues at hand, the media capture, the rising disinformation, which is so much reflected now in the war against Ukraine. So I really hope that the coming months will be constructive and leading to a much stronger Media Freedom Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Renate. So I take away 3 keywords: transparency, trust, and independence. And the independence applies to editorial independence, but also to ERGA Plus or to some other form of regulator if ERGA Plus is not capable of delivering independence. I think basically it ties into the point of MEP Strugario, which is there's a lot of good concepts in the act at this stage, but they need to be strengthened and they need to have teeth so that they can be implemented and enforced in a proper way. I'm sure Eva Shimon from Liberties has elements to add to that analysis.
Yeah, exactly. So what has been already said, I agree with that, and I just echo it just to make sure that you know, it's all heard from different perspectives. That we see how that basically the drafting process must have been more ambitious than the final outcome. And the problem is that there are substantive parts that recommendation section appears but not in the regulation, and that would mean, or that could mean, if we don't try to improve or push this act to be, you know, stronger, that it just wouldn't be able to tackle the most significant problems and rebalance some structural problems that exist in some member states. And I know we are not talking about all of the member states, because some member states are doing well or better than others, but the most problematic ones, and the problems in Hungary or in Poland, for example, the weakness is that self-regulation does not really exist, and that's true for the Eastern European region as well. And also we cannot really rely on the recommendation part because it seems that these governments would not really follow, you know, if they only face recommendations. I try to collect, you know, a few topics that I think should be, or would be very important to improve. Some has already been mentioned. One is transparency. So what is needed, I think what we have at the moment is just far too weak, what we have in the law. I think the EMFA should require a transparent European public database that includes information of the entire beneficial ownership chain of media outlets. That means that it's not up to the national member states, it's not up to national media authorities, but it's upheld at the European level, and make sure that people and also journalists and investigative journalists have access to this database, because they are the ones to whom it makes sense, and then they could dig deeper who are behind certain media outlets. The other point that I would like to underline that would be important to improve is the state advertising chapter. Because that's really the core, as Renata has already said. So transparent and fair allocation of economic resources is the core, and the question, you know, to try to solve the problem of captured media systems. And first of all, the EMFA only deals with state advertising, and state aid and state subsidies are regulated separately. That could cause from the legal perspective, a little problem, especially in countries where the distortion of the media market is happening through the allocation of these sources. But also this threshold for the 1 million inhabitants for the local governments, it's a very interesting approach. First of all, because in the most problematic member states, Hungary and Poland, there are only 2 cities that meet this threshold, Budapest and Warsaw, and all other cities would be excluded. So I think the law should rather focus on spending limits instead of the limits on the number of inhabitants. As a next point, I think media concentration is something that should be improved because the proposal in its current form is unable to address the existing distortion on the media markets. There are pending complaints in front of the Commission regarding the Hungarian Central European Press and Media Foundation, KESMA, which is a foundation close ties with the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, and now they control more than 400 media outlets, which creates, and they offer themselves freely and to be part of this foundation. But also in Poland, we saw that the oil company PKN Orlen expanded its role, and now they own more than 20 regional dailies, 120 weekly magazines, more than 500 online portals, and they also own the newspaper distribution company, the network of more than 1,000 newspaper kiosks. So what we see, the concentration is Poland, and this is a playbook, and this could happen not only in these two countries, but we saw that in Slovenia before the election, the same trend, and it could happen in other countries. So I think strengthening the rules to make sure that media pluralism exists in the European market is very important. The spyware has already been mentioned by Renata. I would only add there that besides spyware, there are many other surveillance techniques that should be addressed by this piece of regulation, and also support the encrypted communication between journalists and their sources, and that would be very important to improve. And finally, just to mention the media privilege, Article 17 in the proposal, which I think the threat is that it may and lead unintentionally to support authoritarian propaganda, including Russian propaganda, in case when there is this self-declared media has this privileged status. So therefore, I think Article 17 should be reconsidered, and why and who gets this privilege provision, and how to solve that propaganda that is not only coming from abroad, but also in certain countries, governmental propaganda, and especially where public service media is turned into propaganda, does not have this privileged status, but we need to ensure that people get access to information, get access to reliable information, and therefore this part of the regulation should be reconsidered. I stop here, and I'm happy to get back to other points if those are raised.
Thank you, Eva. I think the numbers that you gave in terms of consolidation are extremely interesting, not to say frightening, in certain cases, and that ties into a certain extent into your remarks about media privilege, is that obviously media does not mean the same thing and does not have the same independence in every country. So it comes back to the definition of what is independent media. How do you create trust, and how do you make sure that if you give a privilege, it is not gained by some, let's say, to profit from it. I'm pretty sure that Dr. Baratta has interesting views also on this or on other topics, and let's hear your side of this appointment, Johan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I concur with most of the things that have been said in terms of these appointments. I've been looking into the EMFA also from the point of view of how a good media law should look like. And for example, it is important to note that the European Union has projects in third countries, basically telling them or recommending the things that need to be included in their respective media laws. And I would say that if a third country would have presented the Media Freedom Act, probably would have received the criticism of the European Union because it would have been seen as insufficient in many aspects. And this, I'll talk a little bit about these insufficiencies and the way I see them. First of all, the definition of media that is included in the EMFA combines a little bit definition that is already in the Copyright Directive with the definition that is in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. This leaves out of protection other forms of media that may also have an economic nature and would also deserve to be protected when it comes to preserving independence, protection of sources, so on and so forth, particularly, let's say, bloggers and other forms of, let's say, media discourse or media activities that go beyond conventional media. So it's still, the definition of media is still quite conventional and thus leaves outside very important examples of media activities, even economic activities, that deserve to be protected also according to international standards. The second thing has already been mentioned is the superficial treatment of very important topics. In other words, most of the topics that are covered by the Media Freedom Act sometimes look more like a political declaration than something of binding nature that can really be useful to impose obligations on states or stop preventing states from doing things that are not correct. For example, if we look at it has already been mentioned, at the provisions on protection of sources, they fall short clearly of the standards of the Council of Europe or the standards by the, for example, UN Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression. Therefore, if a member state follows the article and the provisions in the EMFA on protection of sources, these provisions would still be problematic because they wouldn't be aligned with international human rights standards. There are a few things that are missing. Protection of sources, but also when it comes to the independence of public service media, it is quite surprising to see that the European Union, and particularly the European Commission, in the course of the last decades, they have issued very important recommendations and very important decisions in specific cases, clearly establishing very detailed criteria on how to protect and how, independence of public service media should be understood. And in the Media Freedom Act, we find very, very vague references, proclamations only, instead of very clear criteria with teeth, as it has already been said. I have particular concerns when it comes to the media, special media treatment for media on very large online platforms, Article 17, just mentioned by the previous speaker, for several reasons. First of all, because I still don't really understand why to give privileged treatment in the public sphere to traditional media. Why, for example, a piece of content posted by a commercial television, self-promotion, owned by an oligarch, should be treated with more care by a platform than a report posted by an NGO documenting human rights abuses. Why this difference of treatment based exclusively on let's say, the fact that one is traditional media, the other one is different kind of actor, but still disseminate information in matters of public interest. This differentiation, you cannot find it in any international document in terms of justification. The second thing is that Article 17 forces platforms, in order to decide whether to grant these privileges, to make very, very difficult assessments. When a media outlet is editorially independent, what are the criteria? Do we have 100% independent media outlets in Europe? What if a media outlet is only partially independent? Then what should the platform say? Yes, no. The second thing is that it says that in order for media outlets to enjoy this privileged treatment, they also need to be regulated in a certain sense or be subject to recognize self-regulatory mechanisms. Well, self-regulation is only a reality in Nordic countries, and certain forms of regulation don't exist in most of Europe. But so it's a very difficult assessment. Do we want platforms, private corporations, to make these assessments to decide who's in and who's out? Do we believe that platforms are able to take this decision in such important matters? This will create very important conflicts and problems of interpretations. There are also provisions of video sharing platforms that basically give the power to regulators for regulators to kind of send requests to different video sharing platforms without any reference to the country of origin. Are we changing the approach? Or because there's no reference at all when we talk about in the provisions regarding video sharing platforms to these matters of country of origins, and it seems now that all regulators may be able to send requirements to any video sharing platforms. This is something that probably needs to be clarified. The last thing is that I have the impression, but it's only the impression that the Act tries to change the traditional approach that we had to regulation, where the press, written media were self-regulated, and the audiovisual media was subjected to statutory regulation. the expanding role of regulators to cover many different aspects of media law seems to change the approach and to kind of let's say, pave the way for an expansion of the powers of regulators to also cover certain aspects of media companies that also are also in the field of press or that are beyond broadcasting. Is this exactly what we want? Is this good for countries where there are serious issues of regulatory independence? This is another question mark that I have. So I think that at this point, we have, of course, a very interesting piece of legislation on the table, very unique and pan-European approach to media freedom. But I also believe that there are many things that still need to be fine-tuned in order to have a law that is aligned, a media freedom law, a media act at the end of the day, that is aligned with best comparative practices and even international human rights standards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. That was a very detailed overview of specific points that are of concern. It often, at the end of the day, goes into the detail and into the definitions and into seeing who exactly benefits from what or what is exactly covered by a provision. And before giving the floor back to Audrius, I want to highlight that everyone recognized, Audrius, that it's an amazing piece of work in 1 year. So let's start with saying that before going into the details. But it would still be helpful to get your feedback on the points that were raised by the various panelists.
Thank you very much, and indeed, thank you for all these comments and suggestions. What could have been done slightly differently. So at this stage, I was trying to note all of the points, and I will try to be as comprehensive as possible in replying. But excuse me if I inadvertently miss a point. So I will focus primarily on explaining why we made certain choices and why those provisions are as they are in the proposed regulation. So perhaps starting from ownership transparency, indeed, for media ownership transparency, we have a combination of proposed binding provisions, recommendation, and in fact, in the background, we have another element because we have an ongoing project which is about media ownership monitoring and which aims precisely to put together a common database on media ownership in all the 27 member states, not each and every single media outlet, but main market players in each of the member states. So this is a bit the whole scheme of what we're doing on media ownership transparency and why certain provisions in the proposal for regulation and certain in the recommendation. Again, it's about proportionality, I would say, because as Commission we are obliged to be very careful in imposing burdens either on market players or on public authorities. So this is why in the proposed regulation you will find something which is the basic guarantee of media ownership transparency, which I think is already relatively extensive because it would oblige media service providers to disclose their direct, indirect, and beneficial owners. And then in the recommendation, we encourage both media companies and member states to go a bit further, and for media companies to disclose also other business links of owners, and for member states to put in place public databases, knowing that we have this project ongoing and an intention to do this media ownership transparency project also in the longer term, meaning that if the first stages of a project are successful, probably we will achieve this objective of EU database not through regulation but through financing. Then switching to an area which is in a way related, editorial independence and self-regulation, because it's also shared between the proposed regulation and the recommendation. Where we have a combination of carefully drafted principle to take appropriate measures for the protection of editorial independence with a list of best practices which are supposed to be further expanded and refined in the stakeholder interactions that will inevitably come, primarily in the news media forum. So it's not a closed list that we have in the recommendation, but rather an open list. And there, it's the point bringing us back to what Jean said, that we are perhaps changing a little bit the paradigm of media regulation as we know it today. And with this, we were changing this paradigm a bit. So this is why naturally we were very careful. So we were careful not to give an impression that now at the European level we come with a big regulatory hammer and prescribe how editorial independence must be protected in detail, because it might look almost like lecturing, media service providers what to do, while we chose to be more humble and stay with the principles and still leave it to media service providers and the media sector more broadly to work out the details. Turning to a range of questions on state advertising, I agree 100%. It's extremely important that state advertising flows to different market players without distortions or undue preferences. So this is why we have a combination of principles, how state advertising should be distributed, and transparency measures. And this issue was very much raised also by the Commission's rule of law report in different member states. 1 million threshold is inevitably, let's say, we were struggling with different ideas for thresholds, because each threshold is inevitably a bit subjective and inevitably produces some undesirable side effects. Let's say this particular threshold of 1 million was chosen with administrative capacity in mind, because typically very small municipal authorities, local authorities, they typically lack administrative capacity, while of course if you have territories with more than 1 million inhabitants, typically you would have an elaborated administrative structure which is able to bear this additional work on making sure that distribution of state advertising is done carefully and then accompanied by publication of key information on state advertising distributed and its beneficiaries. It's true that another approach could be spending amounts and tying to spending limits. However, there are also disadvantages, because, for example, in the rule of law report, we were examining to some detail the system in Austria, and we have, I think, a limit of 5,000 euros. And still, even with this limit, we have feedback from stakeholders that quite a number of contracts they are made undetected thanks to this limit of 5,000, which is very low, and which we would probably never put in a proposal at a European level. A few words about market concentration and the relevant provisions encouraging member states to have controls for media pluralism in the context of concentration transactions. Indeed, we were in between two imperatives, of course, primarily to preserve media pluralism, but also not to forget financial and economic viability, because it's true, as it was highlighted at the beginning of our discussion, in some cases, concentration is good. It's a way to strengthen media outlets economically and perhaps to enable them to have a better chance against digital competitors. In other cases, it's bad. It's Kashmir and similar examples, which really go in the direction of capturing even the big parts or almost the whole media market, and in such cases, of course, there must be a much higher emphasis on media pluralism. So we were kind of in between different imperatives, and this is why we have criteria suggested in the proposal for regulation encompassing all these different dimensions, but it will be ultimately up to national authorities, and importantly, what is new, up to the board to try to make opinions in each particular case. So so in a way, it will be up to them to distinguish between, let's say, good and bad examples of concentration, and for the good examples, probably to give positive opinions, while for the bad, to invite accompanying transactions with appropriate safeguards. Then you raised also the board and its independence, and the desire to have an independent secretariat helping the board. There, just again to explain our choice was driven also by the cost, of course, with each proposal, the Commission has to assess carefully cost of a proposal, and we were assessing an option of, as it is in the proposal, and an option of a fully independent agency helping the board. And of course, the board with Commission secretariat is a much cheaper option. Now, of course, you could say you should not always think of a cost, and you should also think of a quality. But even there, I would say there is indeed a good chance to have both low cost and good quality, because even with the secretariat provided by the Commission, we could imagine structural solutions which would make sure that the secretariat really serves the interests of the board and is not influenced by other parts of the Commission. Of course, if you react with skepticism, I will understand, but ultimately our choice, let's say our initial choice, this type of board with a Commission secretariat or board with an independent agency, in a way predetermined some technical drafting that we had to do. So these things, agreement of a Commission, request of a Commission, simply stems from the choice. So once we make the choice, it's difficult to avoid them entirely. We can see in the course of the negotiations what positions are taken by the Council and the Parliament, and potentially we could adjust the wording a bit, but probably not too dramatically. Coming to the issue of what kind of media services are protected by European Media Freedom Act, indeed, definition was yet another point where we were exploring possibilities a lot, and we were trying to understand where we could reasonably draw a line. So the line, the way it is drawn in the proposed regulation, is between purely amateur, let's say, media activities, purely, let's say, and on the one hand, and what looks like professional activities on the other. It's true, it will never be 100% clear in all cases. However, quite often, you can distinguish a pure user of online services who occasionally expresses her or his opinion from people who are doing it quite professionally, who accompany their videos or posts with advertising and so on. So let's say in most cases, this difference is detectable, and our knowledge, I mean, collectively, Commission and media regulators will be improving on this distinction, because the need to distinguish is also present already today in our Audiovisual Media Services Directive, and the regulators have started to work in different countries. They have started to work quite seriously on criteria, how to distinguish these different types of content. protection of sources and surveillance. So what we have is a combination of a kind of general catch-all provision, which is a slightly less safeguarding, and a dedicated provision for spyware, which is more safeguarding, because if I count well, this provision on spyware has, I think, almost 4 layers of protections. So four points which have to be demonstrated before spyware can be deployed, and this on a case-by-case basis. So my own impression is that this probably makes deployment of spyware close to impossible in most cases. And then, well, this differentiation was driven partly by reality. We have seen what kind of harm spyware, this, let's say, secret deployment of spyware and very intrusive deployment can cause. And also what we wanted to assure is a broad definition of spyware. So if you look at the definition, spyware might sound like a single solution, a concrete product, but it's not really that, because in the definition we try to capture all sorts of possibilities. So different products, very different things, can constitute spyware. So our hope is that this stronger protection, is available in different situations. Article 17, indeed, I should not forget Article 17. So our thinking there was driven by a presumption that, which is probably correct in many cases, but not all cases, that media companies, serious professional media companies, they do their editorial work. So they already themselves, let's say, filter content that they publish, that they broadcast, and they themselves implement content standards stemming either from law or from self-regulation. So then our thinking was that we should avoid as much as possible the second control by the platforms distributing such content. It resembles a bit, if I can say so, the control of origin principle. One member state controls, and then this content should travel free in Europe. So here it's a little bit like there is editorial control by the media service provider, and then there should be little obstacles for that content to travel in the digital space. But of course, there are question marks how this will work in practice, and how platforms will decide about accepting these self-declarations from media service providers that they meet the conditions, or not accepting. And at least what we try to usefully do is to point in one of our recitals to the fact that civil society and non-governmental organizations, they can play, and also regulators, they can play a role in helping platforms when we have a doubt about self-declaration of a particular media service provider. So in other words, we want to suggest this idea that it does not necessarily have to be platforms themselves deciding a little bit in the dark, but they are encouraged to seek help of people who would know more about the media service providers concerned. On the concrete question on video sharing platforms, this article on video sharing platforms and how it interacts with country of origin principle. So in any case, we have derogation procedures, in particular in the e-commerce directive. So this cooperation to try to enforce content standards vis-a-vis video sharing platforms, it kicks in before the procedure of derogation from the country of origin principle. So in other words, the Media Freedom Act gives a possibility for the regulators of countries of destination to have to seek meaningful help from the country of origin to have media content standards enforced vis-a-vis platforms. And then if it fails, it's still open to the regulator of a country of destination to go through the normal derogation procedures where it would take the corrective measure itself. So it's a little bit complicated, but this is how we were devising this particular article. I think perhaps I will stop there. As far as I can see, I probably covered most of the points, but I'm happy to still clarify if absolutely needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrius. That was a remarkable overview of all the questions and the responses you gave. The main one that stuck to me was that you mentioned humility, and I was going to say, knowing the area you were going to issue an act in and knowing the pushback you were going to get from member states, excessive ambition would maybe have been better at play to start with, rather than too much humility in terms of the provisions. I'm mindful of time because we've actually gone over our 1 hour limit. So unless anyone has a pressing question for one of the panelists, I would say this is the beginning of a long dialogue or a long multi-log that we will have amongst ourselves. I appreciate your responsiveness, Audrius, knowing that you are talking about your act. And so but I really encourage you, and I will provide the same message to MEP Strugario in terms of the European Parliament, to now listen to the practical approach of civil society, who will look at this and think, what does this mean in practice? And start adapting maybe the language so that it works in practice. Thank you so much all for being here today, and let's hope that we see each other again in a next exchange. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.